Now, today, friends, we have a very special episode. This is our first presentation in a series of Glenn Gould at 90 podcasts. Yes, that's right. 2022 is the year that Glenn Gould, had he survived his 50th birthday, would have turned 90 years old. And we can only imagine what he would have left the world in the intervening 40 years, or what he would have made of the world-changing technologies we all take for granted today. It's hard to believe it, but his 1981 re-recording of the Goldberg Variations was one of the very first recordings ever to be released as a digital compact disc. And now that the CD is pretty much going the way of the dodo, we can only speculate about what he would have done in recording going into the 21st century. There were no cell phones, no internet, no CGI animation, streaming, downloading, no social media, no virtual reality, no 16 terabytes of data storage on your desktop when Gould left this world. And yet, against all odds, Glenn Gould has persistently refused to go gently into that good night of historical relics. He continues to have passionate fans around the world, and new listeners and readers seem to be discovering him every year. Now, one of the greatest works to have contributed to the global Gould legend is the film 32 Short Films About Glenn Gould, which coincidentally was shot 30 years ago this year. With its audacious kaleidoscopic structure, modeled on Bach's Goldberg Variations, 32 Short Films was quickly recognized as a landmark in Canadian cinema, winning numerous international awards and critical accolades. More importantly, with its witty, moving, and insightful performance of Gould by the brilliant Colm Feore, the film brought into clear focus the aspects of Gould's creative and personal life, his public persona, and that indefinable something extra that have made him such a continuing source of fascination and even adulation to this day. We're very fortunate to have with us today the creative trio most responsible for 32 short films. Initially, we'll be speaking with the film's director and co-writer, François Girard. Francois is one of Canada's finest directors, with distinguished credits for his work in theatre and opera, as well as film. His work in opera began with Stravinsky's Oedipus Rex and Symphony of Psalms, followed soon after with Wagner's Siegfried, Brecht Weil's Seven Deadly Sins and the Lindbergh Flight, and Sariyahu's Maloof. His stunning production of Parsifal was a season highlight for the Metropolitan Opera, with which he works regularly, as well as the Canadian Opera Company and many of Europe's leading opera houses. He wrote and directed Zed for Cirque du Soleil, their first permanent show in Tokyo, and Zarkana, which opened at Radio City Music Hall and played in Las Vegas. He has directed acclaimed productions of Waiting for Godot and Kafka's The Trial, and in addition to 32 short films about Glenn Gould, his film work includes The Red Violin with Samuel L. Jackson, Silk with Keira Knightley, Boy Choir with Dustin Hoffman, Kathy Bates, and Eddie Izzard, Hochelaga, Land of Souls, and Song of Names with Clive Owen and Tim Roth. For TV, he directed the first episode of the series Yo-Yo Ma, inspired by Bach, and he is joined by his co-writer for 32 short films, Don McKellar. And Don is also a triple threat, actor, writer, and filmmaker. He was a member of an important and significant group of filmmakers who came to prominence in the 1980s, known as the Toronto New Wave, which included Bruce McDonald, Adam Egoyan, Patricia Rozema, and Jeremy Podeswa. He is also and already well established as an actor, founding an independent theater company and appearing in numerous films before he made his directorial debut in the apocalyptic drama Last Night in 1988, a film which, incidentally, feels very, very prescient at this moment. In TV, he was a star and co-creator of Sensitive Skin with Kim Cattrall, plus my favorites, Twitch City and Slings and Arrows. He shared a Tony and Drama Desk Award for the book of his to the musical The Drowsy Chaperone, and he is in every way a staple of the Canadian dramatic and cinematic scene. Welcome, gentlemen. We will be featuring, by the way, a conversation later after we finish with you with Colm Feore, who is currently in rehearsal at Stratford. So I'll be catching up with him. But I really want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I first thought that Colm was going to be with us too and would fill up some of the gaps in conversation, but I'm glad you're talking to him.
Well,
later.
we definitely will. It turned out that he is in 24/7 rehearsal. He's doing Richard III now. So, he's working on his evil. He's got to get his evil on.
Right, that'll be hard for him.
Yes, he's such a sweet guy. Gentlemen, describe where you were in your careers when the idea of doing a film about Glenn Gould came your way.
Well, I guess I'm going to start, Don, because
go for it. It started with you, for sure.
I had just done my first feature film, which didn't have much of an exposure, and I met with Niamh Fitchman to do an adaptation of the play Le Dortoir by a renowned group, Montreal group, theater group, Carbon 14. And this is how I met Niamh. We made this first successful film together. It went on to win all sort of awards. But also that was my meeting with Gilles Maheu and Daniel de Fontenay, the people who were running Carbon 14, and Gilles being the main director. And they offered me to come and do a play with them. They offered me to write and direct a play for Carbon 14. And I was very excited about this opportunity. And the first idea that came to mind was Gould. I don't know how it happened like that, but I remember rushing to the bookstore and buying whatever is available. And I started reading. And I came up with the idea of doing a Gould meets Gould play. And I started working on that, and I actually started writing it. And then to discover soon that maybe it was at first I thought a TV special, a TV 1 hour, and then it became 2 hours. But the play became a film project. My film nature took over. And then soon it became a film project, and Don came on board, and we wrote 32 short films. And so it was a pretty accidental, unplotted event, but it just emerged out of this little opportunity, and then it became the film that we've made.
And Don?
Yes, well, I was young, as I recall. But I had already written a couple of movies, Roadkill and Highway 61, films very unlike 32 short films about Glenn Gould. But I'd also acted, and I had a theater company, a sort of experimental company that did fractured narratives. And I'd worked a little bit with Niamh Fitchman, our producer, who, as Francois says, was the matchmaker. He approached me with the idea of Gould. And for me, it was very exciting because it was more like my theater work. Francois told me his idea of the 32 short films, and immediately it was exciting to me because it was more like the stuff I was doing in theater. I thought it would expand my sort of work in film, and also Gould was already very important to me. I really, in high school, I would listen to him like other kids would listen to Pink Floyd or something in the basement, and I felt a sort of biographical connection based on my childhood in Toronto, and in fact, I had just finished a course at university taught by Jeffrey Payzant.
Jeffrey Payzant.
Payzant, on Gould. It was actually a philosophy course, an aesthetics course. So I was quite well versed in the Gould thought, and then I connected with Francois right away. I was very excited about his ideas. He already had ideas for possible films in the 32, and I immediately saw the potential. I remember when Niamh told me the idea of a biography of Gould, it struck me as a terrible idea because I knew enough about him to know that the life was very undramatic in a conventional sense, and I was already suspicious of Hollywood type biopics, and I thought he would be a terrible candidate for that. because, of course, the sort of main dramatic event in his life is giving up performance, which is not the kind of Hollywood plot you look for. So, but then Francois suggested this idea of 32 short films, which is sort of an anti-biopic idea, and immediately I saw the potential.
That's
also
remarkable.
Don, also, like I'd like to add to this, because I had a sense at the time that, you know, you just said you grew up with Gould, and all of you, your generation, our generation in Toronto, like Adam, Patricia. I remember everybody had like sort of a first reaction that was, "Oh, are you sure?"
Yes.
And then because I think you guys were saturated with the intellectual presence of Gould in a way that I was not. Like Gould was more of a fresh discovery for me. Like I didn't grow up with a picture of Glenn Gould in the corner of my classroom.
Yes, I would be intimidated. I would have been intimidated to do a straight biography of Gould because it's true. I sort of probably revered him too much, and you had a little bit of distance with the
I was it was a fresher look. It was easier for me to come into it. Probably if I knew all that I know now about Glenn Gould, probably I would have been intimidated too. And
because Neve, our producer, tells a story about literally stalking Gould. I think following him home and watching him empty the garbage or something. Or I think he drove around with some garbage to some spot for some mysterious reason and dumped the garbage, and
that was the inspiration of one of the film, like Longfellow, when he drives in the rain.
Yeah,
it was like vaguely inspired.
Not for garbage, but
there was no garbage involved in our filming. Or if they didn't make it
aspect.
Right.
Yeah.
Incidentally, that is a remarkable coincidence, Don, because I took Jeffrey Paysan's Aesthetics of Music course.
Really?
I think that probably we were in subsequent years, because I think he worked on the book for a couple of years, but he also...
That's right. Yes, he was...
Yeah.
I believe it was just published.
Right. He was...
when was it published? I don't know. I don't even want to think about it.
But he dragged us off, amidst, talking about Edward Hanslick and tonally moving forms.
That's right. Hanslick was his big...
Right, exactly.
One of his big references.
Off to the AV Center to see pirated copies of Gould CBC programs. I don't know, they did that for you as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And
I didn't know you did that. Yes, that's right.
I remember Jeffrey Pavin as the... I still have the book. Like it was one of many great books.
Yes.
Which,
Yes, what is it? Music and Mind.
It was the first book. And actually, as of the time that Glenn died, it was the only book about Gould. Now there are over 85 books.
Right.
Which, yes, like probably there were a couple published after. But even at the time, entering the corpus of Glenn Gould, it was like almost like a blessing and a curse at the same time. There's so much to read and so much to see, and
it was a lot of research. And now, of course, it would be too much. I don't know. We would have to be much more selective. But now at that time, we tried to research.
Yeah.
I remember the letters had just been opened. That was the big.
That was the latest addition to our writing, because we had an assistant at the National Gallery. I think was I not already shooting when
I feel like it was just before shooting.
Yeah, we were prepping, and then we found this letter. But in any case, I remember that, well, of course, there was all of the writings and all of the films of Bruno Mont-Saint-Jean, and there's a lot of material too, which I remember digesting all that was among the happiest times in my life. But there was music. There was 110 hours of official discography. And I remember listening to everything in chronology and making notes about whatever touched me or whatever I thought could be the subject of something, or maybe something I love but didn't know what to do with. And then in many passes, going back and having it's almost like a distillation process where you sort out the first keep 15 hours out of 110 hours and then going down to what's left in the film. And that I remember, as Don said, we were young, still are, but a little less. And I remember sitting in my home, and this is at the time where you're not sure that you're gonna be, to be paid to do your work is a miracle. You say, "Oh my God, they're gonna give me money for this," and then I remember, like, for weeks, months, like, just my job was to listen to Glenn Gould's music.
Right. I'm getting
And I
paid
was-
to listen to records.
Not much. We weren't paid much, but we were paid. That was my job. And then for me, it was like there's such a sense of victory that I had made it to a point where listening to Glenn Gould was my mission in life, and it was an extraordinary moment and very happy times, as I recall.
Yeah, you remind me of the novelist Madeleine Tien, whose book "Do Not Say We Have Nothing" has this thread of Glenn Gould weaving through it. And she told me that during the time she wrote it, which is about 2 years, the only thing that she did while writing was listen to the Goldberg Variations over and over. And I said, "How many times did you listen?" And she said, "Oh,
Which one did she listen to? Both?
in
or-
alternation, both of them." But she said between the two versions, about 10,000 times.
Well, that seems a bit obsessive,
Yes.
I have to say.
But like Don, I don't know if you do that, but I've used that trick a lot of times, because when you write, it's always interlaced with other activities in your life. And when you go back to writing the same piece, I often use the same music as a way to
That is
clock,
true.
emotional clock to the work.
That is true. As you know, music triggers memories like nothing else. And you're right. It's easy to get back into this. In fact, I was listening to some of those Schoenberg pieces just last night, just to get back into this conversation. And I was immediately back there. Yeah.
Right. You know, most films about classical music and composers and musicians are simply awful. In fact, there's kind of this great tradition of really dreadful Hollywood movies about composers.
Of
If
course.
you ever
Yes.
seen any of the really hoary old ones, like Song Without End, Tales from the Vienna Woods, is
Yes.
about Johann Strauss.
Yes.
Rhapsody in Blue is especially good, where George Gershwin's father decides that Rhapsody in Blue must be a really important piece because it's over 15 minutes long. He judges its importance by the stopwatch. And of course, then there were Ken Russell's films, which were
The Ken Russell films. I was hoping you would get
yeah,
to those.
well, they're marvelous and awful simultaneously in their own
They're
special
better
way.
than they're actually some of the. I have more affection for them than I do for most of those biographies you're talking about.
Right, but 32 Short Films really was kind of a breakthrough, because it actually is a film about a classical musician that feels like the people who made it know something about the music and actually have an appreciation and some understanding of not only the artist but of the art. And I think that really sets it apart, and it gives it this tone of solid research, sophistication, along with, of course, the multifaceted structure of the 32 films. Did you actually consciously try to rebel, not just against the Hollywood biopic, but against the musical biopic?
Well, where we're skipping the good examples, like probably the one that comes to mind is Amadeus, the Milos Forman account of Mozart's life. And there are others. But I think before we even talk about making a film about a musician, like the biopic in itself is a very difficult genre, like because like it's like we often deal with adapting books to the screen, and like it's always a matter of like difficult reductions and getting into keeping a substance in a shorter form. To take the lifetime, to take a whole life and put it on the screen, and especially a full life like Glenn Gould's life, is a real challenge. So, and then it's very much a matter of finding the right angle, which I think Milos Forman found in Amadeus, where he's looking at the end of his life, the writing of the Requiem with Salieri at his bedside, and looking back at all his life from that angle. So that was a viable solution. Ours was to look at to use the 32 short films as a matrix, as a narrative form, to accept the fragmentation and say, okay, we're not going to deal with the whole thing. We're just going to give you 32 fragments of Gould's life, and we'll do our best to find the most significant, the most essential, the most potent elements, and then it becomes the drawing, fill the gaps from there. And I think that position was not only viable, but was a lot of fun. Like I remember feeling like a kid in the candy store, like picking my 32 favorites, and it was great.
I mean, the problem with most musician biofilms is, as you say, this sort of reductive quality. And in fact, artist biopics, there's that moment, as you say, the classic being from Tales of the Vienna Wood, where he hears the bird singing the leitmotif from Blue Danube or something like that. And you think, that's not, and it turns Strauss into just a mimic. And and there's this sort of false moment of recognition in the audience where they say, oh, that's where he discovered how to be Strauss, which of course is necessarily reductive. And it's almost all composer biopics do that, with performers slightly less, because the equivalent moment is the performance moment where they discover their voice or their biographical torment that inspired them to become a performer or something like that. And the thing about Gould that sort of saves you from those sort of traps is the fact that the most famous thing is kind of his enigmatic quality and the sort of mystery of what made him unique. Of course, you could say, we could have done scenes where he discovers how to tap instead of bang the keys when he was a child or something like that. But that's false. Of course,
right.
All those moments. The closest we got to that, I think, is the thing with him as a child, where he plays the key and listens to the tone.
Right.
But we sort of contrasted that with all these sort of contradictory stories, like the story of him being interested in the stock market, or this,
right.
Things that would seem to be everything. Every time we got close to the sort of revelation of his secret, or we sort of veered away.
Right.
I think so. I think it came from Gould. That's what sort of saved us from that trap. Right. I think.
I think one of the great flaws of those Hollywood films is that they're kind of addicted to the aha moment, right? Like, where did the inspiration come from? Oh, Strauss going in the carriage through the Vienna woods and hearing the post horns and the bird calls.
Yes.
Because he couldn't have just worked it out himself,
No, exactly.
And also the idea that kind of creation, like being a novelist, is a lot of very solitary hard work, which is very uncinematic.
Yes.
But yes, exactly. I think the we have, like, in our film, like, some haha moments, like, when he's at the truck stop, and then hearing all those voices, and we sort of like expose the audience to his creative process, where he's getting the idea of mixing voices, which leads to his radio work, idea of the North, and so on.
Right.
Right. But I think ultimately what it is, like, you talked about what did you say, undefiable something in Glenn Gould? Because
I'm not sure.
I've listened
something clever.
We've listened to we've done all of that work. Like, it's years of my life studying Glenn Gould, then living with it, and then traveling with the film, and then it followed me and Don, like, for all those years. We're 30 years later, and that film is still very present in my world, and people still talk about it. And then here we are today to discuss it. I think there's something attached to that experience, to my experience, that is, as you said, Brian, undefinable. there's a Gould emotion, like something that is bright, inspiring, and pure in the artistic sense that is still touching my heart. And that, I think, is ultimately the drive of the movie. We can talk endlessly about our formal ideas, and as a matter of fact, like how many times was I invited to discuss in a film school or elsewhere the peculiar nature or structure, like the very new structure of the film, where actually 32 short films is one of the most standard structure. It is written and built as a 3 acts narrative, and almost following the Sid Field methods. Like, I mean,
yes. In fact, Sid Field, I talked to him, and he used it as an example of the perfect model film in the contrary version, like the sort of flip version.
But you do have the 3 acts and the turning points, and then because you got the performing years, you got the recording years, and you got the later years, spiritual like ending. And I think and it's almost
well, you're giving away our secrets, but it's true that underneath the job sort of as a writer was to sort of find the covert structure underneath the sort of prismatic fragmentation.
What I'm trying to say is actually the real drive of the film. Yes, I think there's obviously something right that we did with that, and there's a lot of joy and inspiration and all of that. But I think ultimately the drive is Gould himself, and that undefinable emotional, spiritual force that is like beyond our understanding.
Right. If I may just say, this is really a compliment for Francois, but if I may, Francois, if you don't mind.
I don't remember last time you complimented me. Actually, I missed that, so please go ahead.
One of the other things that drives me crazy about most musician biography films is that moment where we see the actor playing a famous performance, like and we're supposed to get a thrill as the audience seeing an actor imitating a musician play, and it just always seems so fake to me. And so Francois' brilliant strategy to avoid that was never to have Colm play the piano.
Right.
We never see him play the piano, and it's never given weight. So we're never judging his skill as a mimic or trying to, as the musicians in the audience aren't saying, well, that doesn't look like he's hitting.
And it's funny because I don't remember once anybody mentioning that or noticing that, because this is a biopic of a pianist, and the actor is never ever pushing one note down. So
yes.
So that's like, that's
because you might have thought, well, let's get to a famous I don't know, like Leonard Bernstein performance of, do a famous performance moment, and instead the only real moment is the closest we get to that is the moment he did after he retired.
Right.
Like the closest we got is this. So, I mean, I think that was really smart, because it's you can never satisfy the audience desire for seeing the famous musician. I always think if you're building to a moment like that, you're setting up a trap.
And then
unless you have the performer can do it at the end, and then you better have I don't know. You better, if you're going to end with that structure, you've got to have, Purple Rain, like in the movie Purple Rain. It's better be a big performance.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's after that, I did make scenes, like performance scenes with actors who were not musicians. In Red Violin, we have that. But in this case, I think also the other effect of that decision was that it positioned brilliant Colm Feore in his own territory, in his own music, the music of the voice, the music of a speech, and here's a master who masters that to.
Colm could have done it. I'm sure he could have.
He will have done it. And he actually, Colm, I've learned so much, working with Colm on this film. And for instance, although he never plays the piano, he studied with his Alexander method teacher. He studied Gould's position at the low positions at the keyboard and the low chair and all it does, and then what it does when you stand up. If you spend a whole life too low playing the piano. What does it do to your backbones when you stand up? And then what you see, Colm, all of his movements are derived from the piano playing condition of Glenn Gould, and then transported into dance, transported into breathing, therefore transported into speech. So it's all about the piano playing. Although he doesn't play the piano, his speech is completely contaminated by piano playing. So I mean, so Colm did very interesting work with this. Yeah.
Right. Well, I want to get back to Colm and how he was cast in his performance, but you did mention that there's a more or less standard structure, which, in a sense, disguises itself with the 32, with the matchup to the Goldberg variations. But one thing that is not standard is the decision to intersperse some documentary elements, interviews with people who knew Gould, a performance with Bruno Monsajean's quartet of an excerpt from Gould's string quartet, and the Norman McLaren film Spheres. Those were very non-traditional things to put into a dramatized film. How did you come to that choice?
I mean, it was part of the very initial idea of exploding Gould and doing 32 fragments, and then there was the permission to use different styles and genre and visual language and narrative language. So that was part of the very beginning, and that, you're right, is probably the idiosyncratic aspect of the film more than its 32. Like 32 scenes is probably, if we made the a study of how many sequence there are in the film in average, you would probably come close to 32. That's sort of a very natural gesture, using different languages, visual languages, narrative languages, styles, is probably more of a new thing or something different. But all of those genres, actually, it was interesting to see how they contribute. You would think of an interview with Yehudi Menuhin as something that would reveal itself on the day. Don, you remember what's on the script? Like Yehudi Menuhin, like what I can send you if you want. I probably could find it in my computer. I could send you what was scripted before we interviewed Yehudi Menuhin.
Yes.
And then he does exactly what it was supposed to do in the narrative structure. He was the one to comment on what it means to leave the concert life.
Right.
Gould, that in 1966 decides that he's not going to play ever again in concert. And here's a man whose whole life is defined by concerts at various ways and various stages. Yehudi Menuhin commenting on that with love and respect, but like completely. So we knew that. And
yes, of course, we didn't script the interviews, but we said this is what we hope that this is what the function will be to get them to talk, hopefully.
Actually, we didn't do what Gould did to
right,
Menuhin.
That's true.
Because Brian, I don't know if you know that story. There's a point where Glenn Gould is making a movie about Schoenberg, a film about Schoenberg, TV film. And Yehudi Menuhin is invited to be part of that film. So he's flying, and then he's not like he's sort of reluctant to come because Schoenberg is not exactly his cup of tea, and like for whatever reason, that's not. But because Glenn Gould invites him, he comes to Toronto, and then there's a car picking him up at the airport and driving him to the studio. And as he arrives at the studio, Glenn Gould gives him a text and then pieces of papers, a stack of paper. And then Menuhin says, "Oh, thank you very much. These are the questions." Gould says, "Yes, the questions and the answers."
You're right. Exactly. Yeah, it's actually true that in about the last 10 or 12 years of his life, anytime he did an interview, he would write the questions, his own answers, and the follow-up questions as well. It was completely scripted. Talk about control. So, Colm, now, how did you come to cast him? Did you know his work already? And what was he like to work with in developing the part? How much interaction and how much of a dialogue was there between you as the screenwriters in developing the role?
If you ask the same question to Colm, you see that our answers are very, very different. He keeps going that like I wasn't sure, and I've made like my version of it. Well, I think I owe a meeting Colm to Deirdre Bowen, the casting director Deirdre Bowen, who's a monument in Canadian cinema. And Deirdre at one point said you need to see Colm Feore. So we actually she drives me to Stratford to see Romeo and Juliet, and he's playing Mercutio, and it dies before intermission, and then we go to dinner. And then I saw him on stage, and I see him at dinner, and we're driving back, and it's really clear in my mind that Colm is the man of the situation. Although I will invite him to come back and do some screen tests in the sense of like, because I wanted to experiment and the voice, and he learned some unlearnable texts that Gould had written. And so it went on a little bit like where I just wanted, I guess, to make sure that my initial love at first sight was not blinded. And then we did a couple of experiments, but like I knew from the moment I saw him on stage that he was a remarkable actor and like the best choice for Glenn Gould. Colm's going to give you a much more complicated version where I made him suffer through I don't know what, but in the end, like it was a pretty perfect path. It was also falling in the same way that film fell in Don's career, my career. Like for Colm, it was he hadn't done like that many films, and that's sort of a breakthrough in the movies for him, for all of us. So I think Colm was very motivated and did the work, like the brilliant work, and he's a remarkable actor, like one in a kind.
I mean, when we were thinking about an actor, of course, even though the film is about this sort of eclectic nature of Gould's, the fact that as we were talking about the way that he can't defined simply, the challenge was always how to keep it unified. We knew that with a performer, we would never get an actor who would cover all the bases of Gould's personality as the script didn't. We sort of avoided, for instance, his alter egos. There's this sort of, which might seem like one of the more cinematic things to do, but we sort of chose to lean into the virtuosic side and sort of the interior side. And that's what Colm immediately represented. We introduce him like an actor walking across the ice saying, I'm the one who's going to play Gould. And we lean into his strengths, I think, with the film. And that's what Colm is. It's sort of there's the show, he's got a bit of a show-offy side, as Gould did, but also he has this sort of obsessive quality and this sort of virtuosic side that Colm is nothing if not a virtuoso. As we went and like in the Gould meets Gould film, we said go for it.
Exactly, and then the Gould meets Gould, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation. Gould meets Gould was my initial instinct. Like it would be a great play. Like Gould talks to Gould for an hour and a half was a possible viable thing, because Gould is not only a piano player, he's a fabulous talker. He's a fabulous talker, and then a great material for an actor. And in the end, like what you get is, as a matter of fact, even like to highlight this aspect of things, when Gould decides to compose, he supposedly left the concert life to dedicate himself to music writing. Well, he did Opus number 1, and he did a couple of other very interesting things, but essentially the corpus of his work as a composer is the radio work, Idea of North, and the North trilogy, and all of the Mennonites, and all of that thing.
Right.
And this is talking. We're in the talking field, and then like you give that to Colm Feore. And here, if we're talking about a piano player, he's also like a virtuoso talker, and you give that to an actor of Colm's caliber, and the match is perfect.
Right. Incidentally, it's fascinating the role that Stratford played in sort of the Gould universe. And it makes me think that, there's potentially a great sequel, 32 short apocryphal stories about Glenn Gould. So I'll tell you a short apocryphal Stratford story. We did a video which was very kindly and generously narrated by Christopher Plummer, the late great Christopher Plummer, and he was doing Tempest at the time. You remember that production of about 10 years ago.
That, yeah.
And so he said, the people who organized it at the festival said, do it off-site so that, you can do it without, any special fees and union involvements and so on. So we basically had a friend whose husband was a Crown prosecutor. So basically on a Saturday morning, they opened up the Stratford Courthouse, and we had an old courtroom to record it. And, Chris came, and, I wanted to introduce him to the prosecutor, the Crown Counsel. And he said, no, I don't think it would be good because actually we've met before. And on that occasion, he was availing himself of my professional services, if you know what I mean. So apparently, during the days when Chris was still, imbibing a little bit, there were a few occasions. So anyway, sure. We sat down to do the recording, and Chris began regaling us with stories about how he and Glenn, back in the days when Gould was the co-music director of Stratford Music, were great buddies, and that they were great drinking buddies, and that Gould was a great carouser with the women. And I was thinking, now that strikes me as a classic case of projection as viewed through the
urban legends.
Yeah, the wine glass scene from a low angle, looking up through the dregs of the wine. So no, Glenn was never a drinker, and he never was a carouser, but Chris absolutely swore that he was.
Well, obviously he was projecting a little there. Yes. And probably, even though he was a teetotaler, I'm sure that he was successful. Women were interested, I'm sure.
Yes. Yes.
Well, he just didn't
Chris
know what
was jealous.
He just didn't know what to do. Like, it just didn't know what to do. Like, yes. Famous stories at the 30th studio with Barbara Streisand, where, like, he was panicking basically whenever he felt that attention.
Yep.
See, it's so interesting to do this interview because we've at some point we'd done quite a few interviews about Gould, but I forget, Brian, that you know the material better than we do.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I have had the good fortune to meet quite a few people who were in his lives and get a few fascinating inside stories. Another one that I think you'll get a kick out of because it speaks to the enthusiasm of the fan base. So I've gotten to know the man who lives in what was Glenn Gould's apartment on St. Clair Avenue West. In fact, this gentleman who's a painter is the only person who's occupied that apartment since Gould's death. And by the time he moved in, everything had been cleared out. It took a year to catalog and send everything off to Library and Archives Canada, where you guys could go and study and research it. But one thing remained, and that was Gould had two pianos in his apartment at that time. And one of them was I think a 9-foot grand, and the other one was I think 5'6" grand that's at Rideau Hall now. And underneath them was a shag carpet. Now, Gould apparently would get so immersed in his practicing and his, music that, he would have coffee cups on the pianos and he would gesticulate and send them flying across the floor. So what was left was a shag carpet with a brown outline of the piano all around it.
Coffee patina.
Yes, all in coffee stains all around, but it was a perfect shape of the piano. So
and now it's on the wall.
Well, no. What he did is he cut out the piano outline and threw out the rest, rolled it up and put it in his storage locker, where apparently within about 6 months someone had broken in and stolen it.
Really?
Yes, the fans are that avid.
Who has it now? Someone listening.
Someone listening.
With that disgusting relic.
That is a truly disgusting relic, and who would want it? But apparently someone did. Enough to steal it.
Wow. Yeah, no, the fans, I mean, Francois and I both have encountered the fans, and we understand we're fans.
Yeah.
Too.
Now, in the actual writing, I mean, this is one of those you should never ask, but the who does what, how did you divide, what sort of a collaboration was it? And, can you remember any notable disagreements about what to put in and what not to put in and how those got resolved?
I don't remember disagreements. I remember lots of exciting, full days in hotel rooms, ordering coffee. At the time, I was drinking coffee, and
Yes.
but the
we worked it out a lot together, so we didn't have a chance to fight because we didn't have our separate camps.
Well, as I mentioned, Don came during the process because I actually had a first draft written by the time I meet Don, and then that's probably a year of my life studying Gould. By the time I meet Don, and Don, Don already was, as for many other subjects, Don is one of the few friends who I would qualify of being of attribute erudition. Like Don has a very wide culture and was, of course, very knowledgeable already in the Gould subject matter. But I did the first draft, and then we started the discussion there, and it just became more interesting because it was this new energy coming in. And then we sort of worked the same way with Red Violin, but maybe in a different scale, where I did an early draft sort of painting what I envisioned, and then Don took over, and then because he's more of a natural writer, but the where to draw the line is always it's there's both of us are in there, and there's Fitchman's ideas here in there too, and it's always difficult.
I remember, pushing for some films more than others, of course, but but it was a true collaboration. That the most satisfying moments to me were moments when I was writing and thinking, "Oh, Francois will love this. This is really his kind of idea." I can see him getting excited by that, and that's really what you want from a collaboration like this, where I believe I was sort of thinking with Francois's brain. So I'm not being coy, but I think we were pretty much in agreement.
Yeah, no, I think it was a great meeting point for us. We had the common ground that we shared, and again, for me, I remember. I don't think, if you're trying to replicate that later, that's 30 years ago. And
yes,
I remember the years I spent working and writing on Gould and preparing that film and listening to the music and reading the books and meeting the people. And then eventually writing with Don and being in prep and then being on set shooting the movie and then editing it. Those years, I think today I can say are probably the happiest years of my life. And then I will have to give Gould some responsibility.
Exactly.
There was a light shining over that time, and that was the Gould light. And it's I don't think we can explain further than that. It's undefinable, as you mentioned earlier, Brian. Mm-hmm. But there's a force of there's an artistic ideal in Gould that I was very much aware of at the time, and I think what Gould achieved in his on his journey is what any artist would dream of achieving, which is full dedication, complete immersion into the world of ideas and the beauty of art, and that's been an inspiration since then for me and many, obviously.
And I think that in some ways, Gould, with his fascination with 20th century music, was still in some ways a very romantic figure in terms of his ideas
Absolutely.
of the moral duty and mission of the artist, the idea of art as a redemptive force and all of that sort of thing. And interestingly enough, even though some people in this cynical age may think that that's a pretty passé approach to what creators do, it still moves people deeply. And I've experienced this. My first real taste of it is actually a Russian story. And when I was fairly new in this job, I had a visit. Our offices were actually on the campus of the University of Toronto, and I got a call, and I was told that there was a visitor who wanted to come and see us at the gate, and that she spoke almost no English. She was Russian, and she was looking for the Glenn Gould Museum. And I said, well, there isn't a Glenn Gould Museum. By the way, over and over and over again, I get people knocking on our door wanting to see the Glenn Gould Museum, and they can't believe that there isn't one. So this
Where is it?
Well, we have a few.
That's a project, Brian. Brian, you got to come up with some.
Honestly, I've tried. When Canada gets better about devoting resources to celebrating its great achievers, we will have not only a Glenn Gould Museum, but also a François Girard Museum and also a Don McKellar Museum.
Right. Oh. Let's start with Glenn Gould. We'll help you.
But anyway, this woman came, and unfortunately I was able to find a graduate student who was Russian who could translate. And it turned out that this woman was a professor at the Moscow Conservatory. And she said that that she had heard Gould when she was a little girl. I don't think live. I think she was too young for that, but on record. And it transformed her life, and that she listened to all of his recordings and came to the conclusion that he was the most spiritual musician who ever lived. And I'm only repeating exactly as this was translated to me. I'm not embellishing. And that inspired her to become a pianist and a piano teacher, and that she had spent the last decade saving up her money so that she could visit Toronto. And she said to even be in the city where he lived was for her a spiritual pilgrimage. And, of course, that kind of very hyperbolic talk makes you feel a little uncomfortable in a way, but the depth of her sincerity was absolutely clear. And then she basically gave me as a Canadian a telling off for not having a Glenn Gould Museum. She explained that, in Russia they have museums for every notable, including,
as I just saw, yes.
Yeah, yes. Dostoevsky and Pushkin's dog,
and Stanislavski, yes, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Anyway, I also had a similar experience, and these are with people who aren't musicians, at a film festival. There was a Glenn Gould Film Festival in Berlin that lasted a week, and back in 2007. And I'd gotten to know this woman who was, she described herself as, a housewife. She literally said, ich bin eine Hausfrau. So I gotten to know her. And at the end of the festival, of course, they played Bruno Monsageon's film of the Goldberg, the 1981 Goldberg Variations, which, if you'll remember, at the end of the aria da capo, the final repeat of the aria, he brings his hands up off the keyboard, places them together, and bows his head almost reverentially. And of course, it feels like a coda to his life when seen in retrospect.
Yeah.
This woman came afterwards, and she was sobbing like a child. I mean, she grabbed my jacket. She completely soaked my lapel. She could not speak. It was really astonishing. And I mean, in a larger sense, it reminds us about how powerful art can be, not just Gould or Bach or a given piece of music, but what an essential part it can play in people's lives.
And and in wartimes.
Yes.
I think, like we're right in the middle of that.
Which we are in now, yes.
You're talking about Russia. I was in Russia just recently. As a matter, I was there when the Ukrainian invasion started. And no one believed that it would happen. So that's not my point. My point is that, like, I can tell you that the very brief visit of Gould in Russia in 1957 when he played in St. Petersburg. Like the echo of that is still felt nowadays. Like in my discussions with artists, musicians, Gould will come up one point or another in the dinner or in the work, and there's this amazing story. Like it's one of my favorite, where Gould comes to play in St. Petersburg, 1957, and he's I think it's the first Goldberg had just been published, but not well known yet in that field for some reason, because that was really a world event.
Yes.
And the when he plays the first half of the concert, the hall is half empty, and but he plays, like it's part of the game. And then they go to intermission, and whoever was in their house went around like through St. Petersburg, through neighborhoods. This is a time where there's no cell phone. There's probably a couple of phone booths with a lineup. By the time the intermission is over, not only did the hall was full, the hall full, but there was a similar amount of people outside in the piazza, like trying to get the vibe of that concert. So that gives, I think this story gives a sense of the impact that Gould had on music lovers, but on people in general.
Well, I can attest to that. And actually, I'm holding in my hand, if you can see it, an object that was given to us as a gift by a fairly distant member of Gould's family. And what this is it's called a palech miniature. It's a piece of very widely available folk art from Russia. And this was actually given to Gould by students of the then Leningrad Conservatory, now St. Petersburg Conservatory, after his final performance in 1957. And the inscription, which you won't be able to see very well in Cyrillic, basically translates as, it has the date, and it says, to Maestro Glenn Gould, from the students of the Leningrad Conservatory, the fire of your inspiration will illuminate our lives forever. Which is pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is that he was subversive in his own way even then, because he, after the actual formal concerts, the days following in both cities, he had lecture demonstrations at the conservatories. And the authorities assumed that he would be talking about the music that he'd played the night before. Instead, he basically presented hour-and-a-half lectures on the Second Viennese School, Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, which was absolutely forbidden music. It was not.
It was forbidden, yes.
And as it was explained to me, the professors and students were there, and there were people like, Rostropovich and Vladimir Ashkenazy and Tatiana Nikolaeva. So they were absolutely fascinated. This was a new world to them. The professors all got up and left because they were convinced that there would be some KGB in the audience too, and if they didn't show that
they would be jailed
of disapproval, yes, it wouldn't go well for them. So they got up and left. But the students basically were introduced to this music because Gould just said, the hell with it, I'm going to talk about this stuff. So
but he performed it.
He did. He actually did.
Schoenberg.
Yep, he did.
We all have stories of cult-like veneration of Gould. I remember when the film was released, going to this sort of bar in Tokyo where they dressed like Gould. My distributor thought I'd be fascinated, which I was. But it's funny you said you used the word romantic when you started this, because I was listening to Gould last night and thinking that was the Schoenberg, and I was thinking it's so romantic, which of course seems like the wrong word, and a word that Gould would probably resist, because the performance is not what we think of as romantic. It's so precise and clear and unsentimental, but it's moving in a way, the sort of philosophy behind it. And as you say, this idea of the artist and the voice is sort of this continuation of romantic. And it's that contradiction between the sort of clarity and the emotion that I really think is unique with Gould. I remember when I was young, I definitely, listening to him playing Bach was the first time I thought, I understand what a voice is, a musician's voice is, apart from a composer. He is bringing something that only he can bring. And I hadn't really understood that until I heard Gould. For then I was listening for the composer, I was listening to the music. But
it's interesting.
it's sort of a miracle that he's able to imbue this voice in whatever he performs. And that's sort of, I think, what he exemplifies to a lot of people.
A voice is a really good way to name it. But it's like, well, when it comes to Romanticism, the elephant in the room is that he completely skipped all romantic pianistic repertoire. Like he went from first Vienna school to second Vienna school, and in the middle, all of the romantic repertoire, the Liszt, the Chopin, the Schumann, the Schubert, all of that is out the window. He didn't play it except for few rare bootlegs recordings. So in concert, he touched at it a little bit, but none of it in the official discography. And yet, like the Romanticism in his life, is quite,
his persona is so.
He's such a romantic character.
Right.
And it's funny because anyway, so much to say about that. That's probably another conversation right there.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Another podcast, Brian.
Absolutely. Well, and listen, I could go on and on, but I'd like to get back to the actual production, because one thing that strikes me about the film, which I watched again a couple of nights ago, is for a relatively inexperienced, I don't want to say that pejoratively, but if director, there is such a cinematic quality. The use of the camera is so fluid and supple. Particularly, I think of that wonderful scene of Gould in the recording studio where Colm sort of, is literally dancing, and he goes down to the ground, and he's seen through this forest of microphone stands. It's really, for something that is in many ways quite an interior presentation, it really moves. And were you just born this way, Francois, or was this something that, your work with your DP helped you to find, or that you just were inspired by the subject matter to create the visual complement to the music, to the musicality?
Oh, I wouldn't know how to respond. Thank you for your kind words. But I think, that day was like any other days that you get there and you're trying to capture whatever is there to capture. What I remember, I remember from that scene, I think it's like, again, I think it comes down to Colm's performance. And I remember Colm and I, we were battling that dance a little bit. And we did something that day that probably today I wouldn't do, because I might be Me Too'd or canceled but I remember going to Colm and putting my hands in his lower back and saying, it was take 4. I think I remember it was take 4. We'd done 3 takes that none of us was feeling, that Colm wasn't feeling, and I wasn't feeling. And I went to Colm and I put my hands in the lower back and I said, if anyone is interested to know, like, this is sex to Glenn Gould. This is the erotic experience. So for me, what I was at the core of that scene was the erotism in Glenn Gould's version. And then Colm gave take 4, and that's what's in the movie. And so it's dancing with Bach in a very erotic way, and it's like full of that passion. And whatever camera work we did, I think, is secondary to that idea. And again, I'm about to Colm's performance, because it's one thing to hear that, and it's another thing to do something with it. But and then this I thought was a very private, not so private now because I'm saying it, but a private exchange between a director and an actor. We leave it at that, and we'll edit it, and the film comes out, and there is a critic somewhere, who wrote exactly that this idea had somehow siphoned through that guy or that woman who wrote the erotism of that scene.
Yes.
And use exactly my word. This is sex to Glenn Gould. This is erotism to Glenn Gould. And I remember being amazed at how did it make it there? And
Right.
it makes you aware of the power of our medium. That yes, we can communicate stuff that is and a lot of nonverbal, powerful ideas or emotions that can actually go through if you just can name them and work with the right people, like working with Colm, who's a remarkable acting virtuoso.
Right.
But again, if Francois being a little modest, I feel like Francois' work as a director, which I saw before I took the job, because I watched Le Detoire, which he had just done, as he said, and I felt, okay, this guy really knows what he's doing. I don't know, can't say where it came from, but it was very important to me that the film looked good, and it had a sort of intentionality, that the work was disciplined in the way that Gould was, and it could act as a sort of counterpoint to the music and to the story. And so I think it can't be dismissed that Francois' work is very exceptional,
right.
And not particularly flashy. Often it's just a single shot for a scene. But again, it's that commitment that I think really carries the film.
And I think it's also one of the reasons the film is a landmark, because this was a time when it was still such a struggle to get a Canadian film made, and the resources were so slim for many of them that a lot of them, even if they were very good, didn't necessarily always look very good, right? They didn't have
that is true.
That kind of polished. I mean, it is a very beautifully polished work.
Yeah, and then we tend to forget. We tend to forget that these films are made in a system, the Canadian film system, that is being threatened every year. Like there's somebody to question its validity or its use, but there's a system eventually that says, yes, we're going to give you. That was not much money. Like it was like a record low budget, but there's still somebody to sign the check.
Right.
An institution at Telefilm Canada and mainly Telefilm Canada to put the money in. And I remember, not that it was quite challenging. I remember the analyst at the time. I wouldn't even remember the name, but I remember being in a meeting with Don and Neve, and this guy is at the end of the table, and he's there to give us his reaction after reading the script. And he's obviously very embarrassed, like he doesn't know how to talk about it. It's very awkward. And he end up saying, well, this is really, really good, really great, but do you really mean, like, are you guys thinking that this would be a film that we would project in theaters? And then I remember my answer. I remember very clearly. Like, and I said, well, I don't know. This is your question that you need to answer. Our question was like, how do we write a movie about Glenn Gould? And what you read is our answer. Now you have to answer if you think it has a shot to be on screens. And a couple of years later, I had played in 35 countries, 1 year in Paris, and so on. So then it had a real life. But there is a system that allows it to happen.
Right.
And the same film or us in a different time or in a different country wouldn't have been able to do it. So we have so Canadian cinema is like we have to give credit to what we built that allows us to do our work. This one and everything that followed in Don's career or in Colm's career. Right. So, and then,
Yes, because despite that assessment, they did go for it.
They did.
We did see the money.
They did. Well,
so we're grateful.
Right. The guy probably thought he would lose his job.
Lucky.
The guy probably thought he would lose his job, but
he ended up being a hero. And that actually does bring us to the reception of the film. Can you describe what that was like? I mean, you alluded a little bit to it, but and also, were you surprised at the way it was received?
Yes, because I have to say that probably Don can say the same thing. So we had our share of successes and also failures in career. That's the way it goes, right? Like we go, but I don't like I've never seen that again. Like this kind of anonymous voice for peace, and we were so not. We came from such a humble place. I'd done a first film that was not well received, where people said, "Oh, he's got talent, but like let's give him a chance." So I was already like probably if Glenn Gould was my very first film, that it would have affected me because the what we read didn't make any sense, right? It was so like over the top, and it was unanimous in every country. But again, like I think at that time I was able to put it in perspective and know that what comes to you is like if you do a Parsifal and everybody like is over the top, like you have to give Wagner the credit because the piece is an incredible masterpiece. And then in this case, I think we collected a lot of the Gould aura. Like
Goodwill.
we were
Yes.
under an incredible bright umbrella, and we did we did the good work. And we were sincere, and we were humble, and we were dedicated. But I think ultimately the impact of the film is also if you study how Gould's impact with his first Goldberg, with his last Goldberg, with everything in between, you understand what kind of reception we received for the film.
Right.
Yes, I think because of, as Francois was saying, meetings like that telefilm meeting, my expectations were very low, actually. I felt, I don't know if this will ever show on screens, but I remember saying to my girlfriend at the time, I really love this movie, like I don't know if anyone's ever going to see it. So it's a very satisfying thing when you can feel that your work, proud of your work, regardless of how it's received. And so it was really a bonus. I remember seeing it in Berlin. I mean, every screening I was sort of astonished that people took it as seriously as they did, and it was sort of validated. I remember once at an airport picking up a well-known self-help book and reading a quote from Gould in the book. And I thought at the time I knew his writing very well. And I said, I can't remember that quote. I can't quite place it, even though it's very familiar. And then I remembered I made that up. I wrote it in the movie. And then I looked at the back, and the attribution was actually the film, although they'd said it was Glenn Gould quote. So
that's hilarious.
So now that's somehow we've meshed with the material so much that something very validating.
One accolade we got with 32 short films, that was actually probably the biggest I've ever got in my career. And it didn't come.
Yes.
It didn't come in the form of a prize. It didn't come in the form of a review. And when it came, I remember calling Don immediately, and we weren't sure. And it's one day, like the Simpsons are doing 22 short stories about Springfield, yes. And we say, it's not 32, it's 22. Is it really us? Are we getting the Simpsons stamp? Right. But we weren't sure until like years later when they actually published a book where there's like a complete confirmation that they were referring to 32 short films about Glenn Gould,
which is one of the best Simpsons episodes, actually. Yeah. So it's true. It's true. I don't know about Francois, but I probably got more calls about that.
That is actually a fantastic thing, and it also goes into the sick and twisted minds of Simpsons writers that they would actually, make that connection. I think I read that Brilliant. They chose 22 because that's how many minutes of actual screen time an episode, episode of a 30-minute animated show is.
That's true. That's a TV half hour. That's true.
So, this has been amazing, and I know that the reactions to the film are still strong and vibrant, because I've been at screenings, for example, at the Toronto Film Festival when they've reprised the film, and I think we're involved in having a restored version of the negative produced a few years ago, And, the response is still very much the same. So, that's obviously a tip of the hat. And I'm glad to say, Don, that you did not end up getting typecast as, really obnoxious concert promoters, because you actually did make a cameo in the film.
That's true.
So believable, right?
Yeah, at the last ever concert at the Wilsh.
I like to think I'm the reason he gave up concert performance.
Well, and a big favor to all of us, because that way he made more records. Anyway, before we go, I just want to thank you for this, and obviously we'll be talking to Colm separately, and that will be part of this episode. But I'd love to find out about current and future projects. I know that you do a lot of opera, Francois, so I've always thought that a Glenn Gould opera would be a great idea if you could find the right composer.
Don, what do you think?
Well, yeah, who would be the composer? That is the question.
Well, I mean, like I think like that's a big question. But how about like writing the book first? Like I don't know.
We can talk about that.
Let's talk about that. We're not sure yet, Brian.
Okay.
Like we need some time.
Right, someone very, very interior.
It's hard to picture his voice as would he be it?
I still think I have a play to make. If you're interested, Don, we can discuss that. But the play I didn't do, like Gould Meets Gould, could be turned into a play.
It would be a great
But
play.
how would you have this same actor playing both parts, or we'll talk.
Yeah,
We'll talk.
CGI, holography,
That's hard on the stage, but
shadow play.
Possible. Possible these days.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And everyone out there, this is a great year to see 32 short films again. After you've seen it, of course, you're going to want to go back and listen to all the records that are in the soundtrack, because it's such a great poem musically when all of those things are, so to speak, collaged together and related to scenes in his life. Thank you so much. And thank you for helping us in this first episode, paying tribute to Glenn Gould at 90.
And let's not forget, we want the coffee-stained carpet back, please.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Please, fess up.
But do an interview with that carpet too. The stories it has seen,
Yes.
I'm sure. Thank you, Brian, and thanks also to the Gould Foundation for their continued support.
Thank you. Thank you.
Of us in the film.
And please keep doing amazing work.
The Glenn Gould Foundation is a registered Canadian charity, and we rely on the support of arts lovers like you to keep bringing inspiring stories to life. Please consider giving by visiting our website, glenngould.ca, and follow us across social media at the Glenn Gould Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Gould Standard.